They told the people of Willow Creek it was just a landslide, a freak thaw in the winter of 1875 that loosened the earth, swallowed a small mining outpost, and buried the dead too deep for rescue. But if you walk the timberline north of the abandoned assay office, you'll see the truth they never burned away. Blackened posts, not from fire, but from chains heated until the iron sank into the grain. A ring of them, 12 in all, half buried in moss, forming a circle no one dares to cross. The elders won't tell you who was bound here, only that they never screamed, not once. The first official record of Willow Creek's containment is filed not under disasters or property loss, but under a classification number that does not match any known county archive, 427C. That number should mean nothing to you, unless you've heard of the child in room 12, the same designation, the same silent erasure, and the same men in the heavy wool coats who arrived without warning, walked directly to the place they meant to take, and left with more than they came for. The miners had been finding things in the tunnels, not ore, not artifacts. Things that looked human until you noticed the wrists, raw and rope-burned, even though no one alive had touched them in years. Bones that did not rot, joints locked as if the bodies were braced against something invisible. When the first one was hauled into town, the coroner locked his office and wrote only a single phrase in the ledger before vanishing from Willow Creek entirely. They are not dead. They are only tethered. On the morning of February 19, 1875, 12 residents were marched from their homes and taken to the ring of posts in the clearing. No charges. No explanation. The snow muffled everything but the sound of chains pulled tight. By nightfall, the government coach had arrived. It was the same coach described a year earlier in Alba, Mal County. The same crest pressed into wax. The same refusal to sign any ledger. Witnesses said the men did not shiver in the cold. They stood in the dark, heads tilted, as though listening for something the living could not hear. If you've ever wondered what binds the living to the dead, you're already standing in that circle, and once you know that, you'll never leave it. The files that survived, if you can call them that, were never meant to be read by anyone outside the chain, but sometimes paper remembers more than men. A half-burnt ledger from the Willow Creek telegraph office shows a single outgoing message the morning after the chains were set. Containment achieved. 12 units secured. Proceed per 427C protocol. There is no record of who sent it, no signature, just the faint impression of a seal that matches the one found on the envelope that erased the girl from room 12's file. And if you think that's coincidence, you haven't been paying attention. This wasn't about mining rights or keeping disease from spreading. It was about silencing a pattern that was already too visible. The miners who found the first body said its eyes were open, wet, as if it had been breathing moments before they unearthed it, but when they touched it, frost formed instantly across the skin, and their hands blistered like they'd been pressing against a stove. The town physician, Dr. Halbert, tried to send samples to Salem for analysis, but the crate never arrived, and by the time he wired to ask about it, the reply came not from Salem, but from a Washington office that didn't exist on any map. Samples received, destruction confirmed, cease all inquiry. That's the same phrasing used by the federal transport agents in Albemarle County, down to the placement of the commas. Whatever was bound in Willow Creek had the same signature as the child in room 12, the same unnatural stillness, the same distortion of time that made hours slip, repeat, or vanish entirely in their presence. Survivors of the clearing that night claimed they saw the chains tighten without anyone pulling them, as if the posts themselves were drawing the captives inward, spine by spine, until their necks locked at the same angle and their eyes fixed on the tree line. No one dared approach until the coach doors opened and the men in wool stepped out, not to inspect or to question, but to count. And once they had 12, they nodded once to each other, as if confirming a long-delayed delivery. When the coach left, the The snow closed over its tracks, and in the morning, the posts stood empty, the iron rings swinging in air that did not move, and the only sound was the echo of chains beneath the ground, still pulling on something you couldn't see. The designation 427C was never a medical code, never a legal classification. It was a route, a hidden corridor through the machinery of government, a way to move certain instances without oversight, without paperwork that could survive a century, and in both Willow Creek and Albemarle County it functioned the same way: arrival without warning, removal without record, silence without question. The few who pieced fragments together noticed something else, something more dangerous than the events themselves. 427C did not just follow anomalies, it hunted them, as if someone had been tracking these distortions in human form across years and states, binding them in one place until retrieval was authorized. In Willow Creek, the retrieval was more elaborate. Before the coach came, a structure had been raised overnight at the edge of the clearing, a crude frame of black pine lashed together with wire, and in its center, a beam inscribed with markings no one in town recognized, but that matched sketches from Dr. Corwin's private notes about the girl in room 12, 2 vertical slashes with a gap between, repeated 12 times around a circle. The captives stood inside that frame for hours, motionless, their breath visible but their eyes unblinking, and when the sun rose the next morning their shadows were gone, as if the light refused to acknowledge them. One logger who stumbled upon the site before the coach arrived claimed he heard all 12 humming, not in unison, but in a kind of layered sequence, each voice just slightly ahead or behind the others, creating a ripple that made his teeth ache and the air feel thick. And when he tried to step closer, he found his boots sinking into the snow, even though it was frozen hard everywhere else. The government men arrived mid-morning, walked directly into the frame, and one by one unlocked the chains without the captives moving at all, as if the act of release required nothing from them. The moment the last shackle fell, the air cracked, not like thunder but like glass breaking inside your skull. And in that split second the captives' heads turned toward the same point in the sky, their eyes catching the pale winter light in a way that made them look molten, and then the men in wool coats led them into the coach without a word. No one saw them again, but 2 nights later every clock in Willow Creek stopped at the same minute, and when they began ticking again, the date had changed. Not to the next day, but to one that hadn't happened yet. When the clocks restarted, they all read March 3rd, 1887, 12 years into a future no one in Willow Creek had lived yet, and the effect was not confined to the timepieces. Ledgers in the general store had entries for goods that hadn't arrived. Letters appeared in the post with stamps that had not yet been issued, and one miner found his own handwriting on a payroll stub for a company he had never heard of, dated with that same impossible year. The townspeople tried to dismiss it as mechanical failure or some cruel prank, but the older hands remembered the hum from the clearing, the sensation that time itself had been bending under the weight of those 12 fettered figures, and they began to whisper that the captives had not been taken away at all, that they were still here, pulling the town forward into a year it had not earned, and that every tick of every clock was now running on borrowed time. The preacher warned from the pulpit that the chronology of men was no longer under God's keeping, and within days his church bell, once the heartbeat of the town, refused to chime, the rope stiff and unresponsive no matter how hard it was pulled. In the saloon, talk shifted from gold prices to the date, and whether anyone should mark it down for fear of being noticed by the wrong eyes. Then came the telegrams, thin yellow slips sent not to the mayor or the sheriff, but to private citizens whose names appeared in no government directory, each bearing the same 5 words: retain silence until retrieval complete. No signature, no seal, just that same ink density found in the Willow Creek telegraph office's burnt ledger, the same tone as the message that had erased the girl in room 12. And that's when people began to vanish, not in groups, not with spectacle, but one by one, always someone who had spoken aloud about the date, always at night, their doors found bolted from the inside with no footprints in the snow. By spring thaw, there were 8 gone, and the townsfolk realized the number mattered, that it was counting down, not up. The government coach never came back, but the sound of chains could still be heard beneath the frozen earth on windless nights, and those who stayed swore that when they passed the old assay office after dark, their own shadows lagged just a step behind, like they were no longer in perfect agreement with themselves. It was old Maeve Dorrance, the midwife who had birthed half the living town and buried most of the rest, who first said the number aloud in the open, her voice thin but unshaking. "It'll be 12, same as them in the clearing." And though no one wanted to admit she might be right, they all began watching the faces left in Willow Creek, as if measuring them against an invisible tally. Maeve claimed she had seen the fettered ones more than once since the coach incident, not as bodies, but as silhouettes flickering in the seams between lamplight and shadow, each one missing a feature, a mouth, an ear, the slope of a shoulder, like parts of them had been claimed by another time. The sheriff tried to dismiss her stories until he found his own deputy's boots standing neatly by the jailhouse cot one morning, no deputy inside them, the leather still warm as if their owner had only just stepped out, and in the toe of one boot was a scrap of brown paper, the same handwriting as the telegrams, reading simply, "9 remain." From that day forward, the town lived in a kind of silent arithmetic, every face in the market or along the single muddy street a living digit in a shrinking sum, and no one dared venture beyond the outer fence after sunset, for fear the chains might claim them ahead of their turn. At night, Maeve said she could hear not only the dragging of iron, but a second sound beneath it, like the wet rustle of something organic being pulled apart very slowly, and she swore that sound was not coming from underground, but from somewhere nearer, inside the walls, perhaps even inside the people themselves. She took to carrying a lantern at all hours, muttering that the shadows could not divide what they could not fully touch, but even the lantern seemed to falter near the old clearing, its flame bending toward the earth as if drawn to something below. Then came the day when the Ox all stopped again, not at a new year, but at the precise hour of the first government raid, every pendulum, every second hand, even the pulse of the town's one-wall clock frozen mid-tick. And in that stillness, Maeve whispered to the few who would listen, "The year ain't coming to us this time. We're going to it." They went at dusk, because Maeve swore the light just before nightfall was the only time the earth loosened its hold enough to be pried open, and so a handful of the remaining townsfolk, shovels in hand, crossed the brittle grass of the clearing with the hesitant reverence of trespassers in a cathedral. The chains were still there, looped and half-buried, but when they brushed away the moss, they found that each link was etched with marks too deliberate to be corrosion, spirals, tally lines, and shapes like fractured suns, all cut so deep the iron felt soft to the touch. The digging was slow, the soil packed with roots that writhed when touched, as though reluctant to yield what they guarded. But after an hour, one shovel struck something that rang, not like metal, but like bone under tension. They scraped it clean, and saw it was neither coffin nor stone, but a long, pale arc embedded in the ground, jointed like a spine, only far too large for anything human. It curved into the earth at both ends, disappearing deeper than they could reach, and from its marrow seams a faint vapor rose, curling into shapes like hands that gripped the edges of the hole. Maeve, lantern trembling, muttered that it wasn't a body they'd found, but a hinge, something meant to open, and that if they kept digging, they'd be prying at the door to wherever the fettered ones had gone. The sheriff ordered the hole filled in, but the dirt refused to stay packed, sagging as if something beneath it was breathing, drawing each shovelful back into the dark. That night the chains rattled so violently the sound carried all the way to the river, and those who dared look from their windows swore they saw the clearing lit from below by a sickly, shifting glow, the kind that casts no shadows but makes the skin crawl as if shadowed nonetheless. By morning, one more house was empty, the bed still warm. The boots bang, the door, and in the street outside, burned into the packed mud, was the shape of a link in the chain, perfect, blackened, and still radiating heat. The paper in Maeve's apron pocket read, 8 remain. By the time the number reached 8, no one in Willow Creek slept through the night. Doors were barred, windows nailed shut, and lanterns left burning until the oil was gone. Yet the chains in the clearing still rattled with the steady insistence of something that knew patience was its greatest weapon. Maeve, gaunt and sleepless, insisted that waiting would only tighten its grip, and so she led a smaller, desperate band, 4 men, 2 women, and herself, back to the hollow under a sliver of moon, each carrying more resolve than sense. This time they brought no shovels. They came with ropes and picks, prepared to breach whatever hinge bone they'd uncovered before. But when they reached the clearing, the chains were already drawn tight into the soil, humming faintly, the carvings on their links glowing like veins under the skin. The ground around the arc of bone was soft now, damp, as if something beneath had melted the earth itself, and when they pried at it with the picks, the first crack they made released a hiss so cold it stung their teeth. The vapor was heavier this time, curling low to the ground before sliding up their legs like an animal scenting its prey, and the lantern light seemed to warp through it, bending shadows into forms that didn't match the living bodies present. They broke through at last, the picks shattering part of the spine with a sound that was not splintering but screaming, low, wet, and resonant, as though the ground itself had a voice. Below was no soil at all, but a shaft of smooth black stone descending far past the range of the lanterns, and from within came a faint sound of water dripping. No, not water, but something slower, thicker, and accompanied by the irregular scrape of chains dragging against stone. Maeve leaned in too far, and her breath clouded in the cold that rose from the dark, carrying with it a whisper so clear that every ear caught it. One opens the way, the rest follow chained. She recoiled, but the whisper stayed, crawling along the inside of their skulls until the youngest man dropped his rope and began to climb down unbidden, hands gripping the slick stone like he'd done it before in another life. They called after him until their voices frayed, but he didn't answer, and the only proof he had been there at all was the slow, rhythmic tug on the rope that continued long after the length should have run out. The rope quivered once more, then went slack, the end vanishing into the oily dark, and Maeve, against every thread of reason, tied the remaining coil around her own waist, muttering that if one was lost, they could not leave him to whatever waited below. The others protested, but their words felt small in that clearing, their voices swallowed before they could echo, and with a final glance at the chained arc in the earth, now trembling faintly as if breathing, she lowered herself into the shaft. The walls were cold and slick beneath her palms, the stone not carved, but poured, molded into a perfect cylinder that smelled faintly of brine and something metallic. The light from above shrank quickly until it was a pale coin, and the rope creaked with each careful descent, the air thickening, pressing in against her lungs as if she were sinking through water that had never known the sun. Somewhere far below, the scrape of chains continued, steady and patient, and soon it was joined by another sound, and a rhythmic clink, lighter, like links brushing against bone instead of stone. She called the young man's name, her voice climbing the slick walls and dying halfway, but instead of his reply came a whisper just behind her head, close enough that the rope brushed her cheek in the same instant. Too late to climb back. She froze, and the air shifted, warmer now, carrying a copper tang so strong she tasted it, and in the lantern's weak circle she caught movement. A pale hand, thin to the point of bone, resting on the wall 3 feet below her. It was not gripping the rope, not reaching for her, simply resting there, fingers spread, nails blackened, the skin cracked and weeping thin lines of something dark. She could see no body attached to it, only the hand, still and wrong, and then it slid out of sight without sound. Maeve descended faster, breath shallow, until her boots met solid ground, a small circular chamber whose floor was slick and sloped toward a single grate in the center. Through it came the sound of water, or blood, falling drop by drop, and around the walls hung chains, hundreds of them, each ending in a manacle, each manacle locked around nothing at all, except for one, where the iron clasped the ankle of the young man, his eyes wide and blind, lips moving in a silent scream as something in the darkness behind him pulled the chain slowly taut. Maeve rushed forward, slipping on the damp incline, her boots skidding across the stones as the chain rattled in sharp, impatient jerks, and the boy's hands clawed at the manacle, skin tearing under the iron's bite. The lantern's light faltered, dimming as though the flame itself feared what it was illuminating, and in that suffocating glow Maeve saw the source of the pull, not a figure, not even an arm, but a shadow thick enough to have weight, rising from the grate as if poured upward, its edges writhing with shapes that suggested faces, teeth, and hollow sockets where eyes should have been. The boy's mouth opened wider now, but no sound escaped, only a mist that curled toward the shadow as though feeding it, and the chains along the walls began to stir, their metal links twitching, reaching, until the air rang with a low, harmonic hum that burrowed into bone. Maeve dropped to her knees, fumbling for the keyring she'd seen on the surface, but found only wet stone. No keys, no lock she could open, only the cold certainty that the iron around his ankle had been forged to hold more than flesh. The shadow swelled, pressing against her chest with invisible hands, and the boy's eyes rolled back, the whites veined with black, his lips shaping a single word over and over. Below. Without thinking, Maeve gripped the chain itself and pulled, feeling the links bite into her palms, the hum rising in pitch until it was almost a scream, and in the flicker of her lantern, she caught sight of dozens, no hundreds, of faces staring at her from the walls, not carved, but trapped beneath a translucent sheen, their mouths open, their eyes following her movements. The boy's body jolted, as though yanked from inside, his ankle bending at an unnatural angle, and Maeve, with a cry that sounded more like a growl, hurled herself toward the grate, straddling it as the shadow surged upward, its surface, slick like oil, yet impossibly cold where it brushed her skin. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw a doorway inside it, arched, stone, and impossibly far away, before the lantern went out completely, leaving only the clink of the chain and the slow, deliberate sound of it being reeled into the dark. Maeve's fingers slipped on the wet iron as the unseen force yanked the boy downward, his frail frame jolting against the stone lip of the grate before vanishing into the black like a fish snatched into deep water, and without hesitation, without thought, she lunged after him, feeling her knees crack against the rim as her body plunged through the narrow opening, the cold instantly enveloping her like a second skin. It wasn't falling, not exactly. It was being drawn, pulled through something thicker than air, a descent without gravity where her lungs refused to work and her heartbeat echoed far too loudly, as though she were underwater in a vast, empty ocean. Shapes swam around her, human outlines, some twisted and bent in ways that defied anatomy, some nothing but gaping mouths or endless arms reaching, and she realized with horror that these weren't hallucinations, but people caught mid-motion, trapped in the same dark current that had her. One reached for her ankle and she kicked, the touch sending a wave of ice through her veins, and then without warning, her boots struck ground, soft, uneven, damp, though no light marked where she'd landed. A dim red glow pulsed somewhere ahead, and as her eyes adjusted she saw she was in a corridor lined not with stone, but with ribs the size of tree trunks, curving overhead into a ceiling of bone. The air was rank with the sweet sour rot of something that had once been alive, but had long ago learned not to die, and ahead, standing perfectly still in the crimson haze, was the boy, his back to her, his ankles still bound by the chain that trailed into the darkness behind him. "Maeve," he said, though his voice wasn't a child's anymore. It was layered, dozens of tones speaking at once, some male, some female, some neither. And when he turned, his face was not his own, but a shifting mask of all the faces she'd seen in the walls above. He smiled, and the chain coiled like a serpent at his feet, then tightened, pulling both of them forward toward the glow that now revealed itself as a doorway, its frame etched with symbols identical to the ones Maeve had seen in the forbidden records of Room 12. Something was waiting beyond, something patient, ancient, and terribly familiar, and Maeve understood in her bones that crossing that threshold meant she would never again be counted among the living. The pull was irresistible, not a force she fought against, but one that rewrote the instinct to resist, as though the marrow in her bones had decided to obey something older than her will. Her boots dragged across the fleshy ground, each step sinking slightly, releasing a faint squelch, as if the earth itself were breathing beneath her. And with every inch closer, the symbols along the bone-framed doorway began to bleed, thin rivulets of black ichor running down to pool around her ankles. The boy, or the thing wearing him, did not look back, his gait slow, ceremonial, like a priest leading a sacrifice to an altar. And when they reached the threshold, Maeve could hear it at last, the low, thrumming chant of countless voices speaking in unison from the other side, in a language she recognized but could not place, a language she'd heard once before when the records of Room 12 had been played backwards in the archives, an accident that left 3 of her colleagues unable to speak for a week. She thought of turning back, but behind her the corridor had changed. Where there had been ribs, now there was only an endless wall of pale, eyeless faces pressed together, mouths opening silently as if to drink her in. She stepped forward, and the temperature dropped to a depthless cold that gnawed at her teeth, and the doorway did not feel like crossing into a room, but into a throat, swallowing her whole. On the other side, the space was vast, domed, and impossible. It was as though the architecture had been grown rather than built, with walls that pulsed faintly like living muscle, and a ceiling that glittered with wet, vein-like strands, dripping steady beads of black liquid into pools along the floor. In the center stood a ring of figures, each bound in heavy chains that fed into the floor, their skin gray and stretched, their heads bowed in perpetual penance. From their mouths came the sham ant, breath-rattling, words older than Willow Creek, older than Oregon, older perhaps than the earth itself. The boy stepped into the ring, and the chains coiled eagerly around his wrists and neck, their iron biting deep into flesh without breaking it, as though they drank what they needed without spilling. One of the bound figures lifted its head to look at her, and she recognized the face, not from her life, but from an illustration buried in the margins of the Room 12 files, a man listed only as Subject 0, missing since 1834. His eyes locked on hers, not merely looking but entering, as though his gaze threaded itself through the delicate wiring of her thoughts, knotting, pulling, rearranging. And when his mouth opened, the sound that came was not one voice, but many, each layered atop the other, speaking in registers that made her bones hum and her teeth ache. The words were in that same impossible language, yet she understood them as intimately as her own name. "You have come through the mouth, you will leave through the bone." The other bound figures began to sway, their chains clinking in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and she realized with a sick twist of recognition that the tempo was accelerating, her pulse being urged faster, as if they meant to burn her alive from the inside without flame. The boy's head tilted back unnaturally far, vertebrae cracking in sequence like a lock being undone, and from his throat poured not a scream, but a column of black vapor that spiraled upward to the ceiling, where it clung like smoke made of iron filings. Maeve staggered back, but there was nowhere to retreat to. The fleshy floor had begun to rise and ripple, her boots sinking into it as though it meant to claim her as part of its structure. Subject Zero's voice lowered, becoming a whisper she felt against her skin. Room 12 was the seed. This is the tree. Her mind snapped to the archives again, the sketches of tree roots beneath the floorboards of St. Augustine's, dismissed by her peers as delusions of fever-mad patience, but here they were, coiling thick and pale around the chamber, each root tipped with what looked like a human jawbone. The chant surged, louder now, and the chains binding the figures began to glow faintly from within, like veins lit by molten light. The smoke above writhed violently, and droplets of black rain began to fall, each drop that touched her jacket burning through. The fabric in perfect circles. The boy's face was now entirely still, eyes glassy, mouth slack, as if he had been hollowed out completely to serve as a conduit for the voices. Subject Zero's chains rattled once more, and then the others joined in, each speaking her name in perfect unison, though she had never given it to them. That was when she realized they were not summoning her, they were claiming her, and the air behind her was sealing shut like a wound. The walls began to breathe, slow at first, then with a pulse that matched the awful cadence of the chant, drawing in, exhaling, and drawing in again, until Maeve could feel the damp pressure closing around her ribs. The roots overhead writhed like eels in water, their bone-tipped ends lowering to brush her hair, her shoulders, each contact leaving behind a cold that sank straight into the marrow. The black rain fell heavier, pooling at her feet, but instead of splashing, it was absorbed instantly by the fleshy floor, which shuddered in response like a living thing being fed. The boy's limp body jerked once, twice, and then lifted without visible support, his chains straining, his toes dangling inches above the ground. From the open wound of his mouth poured a slow trickle of teeth, too many to have been his, each clattering to the floor before being swallowed by the pulsing ground. Maeve's hand went to the revolver at her belt, but the metal was ice-cold and slick with condensation, refusing to leave its holster as though it too had been claimed by the room. Subject Zero's face remained hidden in shadow, but she could feel his attention press harder against her mind, an invisible weight bending her thoughts toward something that wasn't hers. "You've come to end what began in room 12, he said, his voice now entirely his own, low and deliberate. But you are only here because it allows you. Behind him, the figures in chains began to dissolve, not into dust or liquid, but into streams of tiny pale moths that swarmed upward into the black smoke ceiling, vanishing within it. The air grew hotter, the smell of scorched hair and copper filling her nostrils, and she saw the roots start to drive themselves into the walls, cracking the chamber's surface to reveal glimpses of darkness beyond, as if this place was only the outer skin of something much larger. Her boots were now ankle-deep in the warm, breathing floor, and with every heartbeat it rose higher, threatening to pull her under. She tried to shout, but her voice didn't carry. Each word left her lips as vapor, instantly devoured by the air itself. Then Subject Zero raised his head, revealing eyes like pools of mercury, and simply said, "Your turn." The floor surged upward like a living tide, swallowing Maeve to her knees, then her waist, the texture a nauseating blend of wet clay and muscle that gripped and pulled with deliberate intent. The roots overhead plunged downward like spears, some grazing her skin, leaving behind lines that steamed and smoked as though burned from the inside out. Her vision fractured, not in blinks but in layers, each scene peeling over the next, and she was no longer only in Willow Creek's chamber, but in a candlelit stone room that stank of salt water and rot. St. Augustine, 1849, room 12. A priest in crimson robes traced circles in ash, while a boy knelt before him, mouth sewn shut, eyes pleading. A silver basin at their feet writhed, filled not with water, but with something black and shifting, as if night itself had been poured inside. Maeve felt herself pulled deeper, past the boy's trembling form, into the basin's surface, and in that moment, the room's chant, both in Oregon and in Florida, merged into one impossible voice. The roots coiled around her arms, pinning them, and she felt something move into her, slow and cold, like smoke finding its way into the hollows of her bones. Shadows crawled across her skin, forming shapes, letters she did not recognize but could feel, each one a blade drawn across the inside of her mind. She tried to resist, to tear her eyes away from the basin, but in it she now saw the boy from Willow Creek. Subject 0, standing beside the priest in room 12, unchanged, unaged, watching her through centuries. The walls in both places began to fold inward, layers of stone, flesh, and root collapsing into a narrowing tunnel of darkness, and she realized she was being pulled toward a point where time itself didn't exist. As the black floor reached her chest, she heard Subject 0 whisper, not aloud, but from inside her skull, "Now you know why no one leaves who lay." Then her body dropped the last few inches, completely submerged, her final breath tasting of blood and salt as the two places became one. The moment the black tide closed over her head, there was no splash, no sound, only an endless suspension, as if the world had been stripped of air, gravity, and mercy alike. Maeve floated, not in water, but in something thicker, a medium that clung to her skin and pulsed with a faint heartbeat not her own. Shapes swam around her in the dark, slow and deliberate. Human outlines at first, but wrong in their proportions, their limbs too long, their heads bowed in a way that suggested both shame and obedience. One reached for her, fingers webbed with strands of light that burned in the darkness, and when it touched her wrist, a torrent of memory, not hers, flooded into her mind. The building of the chamber in Willow Creek in 1793, the transport of a bound and blindfolded man across the Atlantic to St. Augustine in 1801, the sewing shut of his lips in room 12, the same chant echoing over decades in two different lands. She realized with sick clarity that the chamber beneath Oregon was not a site, it was a receiver, a mirror to St. Augustine's prison for the soul. And she was now in the space between, a stitched seam of reality where those who had been fed to either location lingered. The figures around her turned their faces toward her, each revealing the absence of eyes, only deep sockets filled with a roiling blackness that moved like liquid smoke. One of them leaned in close, the smell of old earth and ocean brine seeping from its mouth, and it whispered, not in sound, but in a vibration that traveled straight into her skull, "You are here because the key must choose its keeper." The words twisted inside her, becoming images of a rusted iron object with no clear form, changing each time she blinked. Sometimes a lock, sometimes a blade, sometimes a jawbone. As the darkness pressed tighter, Maeve felt the roots of both worlds, Oregon and Florida, closing in, binding her in the narrowest point of this in-between space, and she knew, with the kind of certainty that kills hope, that whatever the key was, once she touched it, leaving would no longer be an option. She would either carry the chamber's hunger forever or become part of its walls. Her hand rose, trembling, though whether from her own will or the gentle, inexorable pull of the void she couldn't tell, and the shifting key hovered inches from her fingertips, its edges bleeding into the surrounding black, as though reality couldn't quite decide if it existed. Each pulse from it sent ripples through the figures around her, and in those ripples she saw fragments, brick corridors slick with condensation, shackled ankles scraping stone, a candle burning in a room with no door, the muffled sob of a man who had been alone so long that his voice no longer knew how to shape words. The key seemed to hum in recognition, as if measuring her, weighing the marrow in her bones against some ancient debt written before she was born. The faceless being circled tighter, and one, its jaw splitting far wider than human, let out a low, vibrating growl that made the space around her tremble like stretched skin ready to tear. Maeve's breathing became shallow, her chest constricting as the thick medium she floated in began to seep into her mouth, cold and bitter, tasting of rust and centuries-old rainwater. Somewhere in that suffocating darkness, a second presence emerged. Not one of the eyeless sentinels, but something older, more deliberate, moving with the calm inevitability of a predator that had no need to hurry. She felt it before she saw it, a surge of heat against the freezing void, a mind brushing against hers, and in that instant she understood. It was the same force that had been worshipped in Willow Creek's founding, the same that had whispered to the builders of St. Augustine's Room 12. It spoke only one word, but it was enough to anchor her to the path it intended. Take. The command struck like a hammer to her skull, scattering any last thought of resistance. Her fingers closed around the key, and the instant she touched it, the figures vanished. The void split like a wound, and she was falling, not into water, not into air, but into the blinding glare of a lantern swinging above her in the original Willow Creek chamber, its shadows writhing in patterns that no human architecture could produce. Somewhere above, she thought she heard the sound of a door locking, though she couldn't tell if it came from this place or from the other side of the world. The key burned in her palm now, not with heat but with a kind of living vibration, as though it was breathing through her skin, drawing from her pulse the way a leech drinks from blood. And as she stumbled forward, the lantern's swing revealed more of the chamber, walls that curved inward unnaturally, meeting at corners that seemed both sharp and endless, each brick etched with symbols that shifted when she tried to focus on them, rearranging themselves into letters she half recognized from the crumbling hymnals of St. Augustine's. The air was thick with a rhythm, faint but persistent, a slow and deliberate beat that didn't match her heart, but rather dictated it, forcing her body into sync as if her own flesh was no longer her own. She realized then that the chamber wasn't empty. Against the far wall, a shape moved, chained at the wrists and neck, its body wrapped in rotting cloth. But its eyes, human eyes, wet and glistening, were fixed on her with such desperate recognition that she almost called out. The figure strained toward her, the chains groaning, and though no sound left its mouth, she heard the words directly in her mind. Don't turn it. Her gaze dropped to the key, and only then did she see that its teeth were wrong. No notches or cuts, but instead tiny, gnashing mouths, opening and closing in silence, each bite snapping at the air like it hungered for something unseen. The lantern's sway slowed, and the light caught on a narrow slit in the far wall, just large enough for the key's shape. Behind that slit, something moved, not the tremor of wind, but the slow undulation of something alive. She felt a pressure in her skull, the same voice as before, smooth and ancient, curling around her thoughts. It is not a lock. It is a vein. Open it. The chained figure shook violently, its mouth widening in a soundless scream, and in that frozen moment Maeve understood. Whatever lay beyond that slit had been feeding for centuries, and the key wasn't meant to open a door. It was meant to let it drink. Her fingers trembled so violently, the key almost slipped from her grip, but the voice in her head pressed harder, now no longer a whisper, but a deep, resonant demand that seemed to vibrate her bones, making her teeth ache. Her vision swam, the walls bending in and out as though the chamber was inhaling and exhaling around her, and every exhale brought with it the faint scent of iron and something sweeter, something like rotting fruit, a scent that both repulsed and pulled her closer to the slit. The chained figure lurched forward until the iron bit into its flesh, black fluid seeping from the wounds, its eyes pleading with a desperation so raw it almost stopped her breath. But the pressure in her skull was unbearable now, pulsing in time with that slow, alien heartbeat, and with each throb came a flood of images, fields in bloom turning black under a rain of ash, children's faces eroded into eyeless masks, an entire town kneeling in perfect unison before a faceless thing towering in the mist. She staggered, and the slit seemed to grow wider without her moving, the darkness within no longer a void, but a membrane, thin, wet, pulsating, bulging outward as if straining to meet her. Her hand lifted on its own, the key hovering inches from the opening, and for a fraction of a second she caught her reflection in the lantern's glass. Her eyes were no longer her own, the irises drowned in a deep, shifting black that seemed to ripple with shapes she couldn't name. The chained figure's mouth moved again, this time the words forced into her mind like a knife. "It will not stop, not with you." But the other voice, the ancient one, slid beneath it, heavier, inexorable. "You will not stop me." The choice was no longer entirely hers, and yet, in that instant, she knew. Turning the key would not only open whatever waited beyond, it would tether her to it forever, binding her to a hunger older than stone. The lantern's flame guttered, as though some unseen breath had leaned close, shadows collapsing inward until every surface seemed to pulse with a damp, living rhythm. And the key, now warm, almost fever-hot in her fingers, slipped into the lock, with a sound that did not belong to metal on metal, but to something softer, like the tearing of wet fabric. The chains rattled violently, the figure convulsing as if caught between agony and relief, and the heartbeat behind the wall quickened, each thud shaking dust from the beams above. The stone under her boots trembled, not with the sharp shiver of an earthquake, but with the slow, deliberate shift of something impossibly vast turning in its sleep. And from the darkness within the slit came a sliver of pale, slick flesh pressing outward, not pushing the wall apart, but bleeding through it, as though the stone itself had become porous. Her breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, her lungs aching, but she could not look away. Her gaze locked on the way, the flesh rippled with unreadable patterns. Symbols, veins, that seemed to rearrange themselves whenever she blinked. The chained figure screamed now, but the sound was not from its throat. It poured from the very air, a raw, skin-flaying wail that peeled back every fragile boundary between thought and terror, and she knew with certainty that even if she turned and ran, even if she fled the chamber and the house and the town, she would never be beyond the reach of whatever waited here. The key turned with a sickening ease, the tumblers inside clicking in a sequence that felt older than language, and as the last click fell into place, the slit did not open. It yawned, the wall stretching wide like the mouth of something starved beyond reason, and a wind surged out that smelled of graves and storms and the deep places under rivers where light has never touched. Something vast stepped forward from that impossible depth, and in its approach, the chamber seemed to stretch into an endless tunnel, swallowing her scream before it could leave her lips. It emerged not with the violence of a predator breaking through, but with the slow inevitability of rot spreading through timber, its form shifting as though it were made not of flesh or shadow alone, but of every nightmare she had ever refused to name, each detail collapsing into another before her mind could seize it. Yet the eyes, if they were eyes, remained fixed, two bottomless wells that seemed to drink in the lantern light, her breath, her memories, until she felt herself thinning, dissolving into the air between them. The chains on the figure behind her went silent, as if whatever had been bound there recognized its master, and in that silence she could hear the thing breathing, a long, wet pull followed by a shuddering exhale that carried with it whispers in a dozen voices, some hers, some impossibly old. The wall around the slit melted into a dark, pulsating archway, and beyond it was not a room, but an expanse of black water stretching endlessly, rippled by unseen currents, the surface broken here and there by pale shapes drifting just below, faces turned upward, mouths open in silent pleas, eyes wide but unblinking. She wanted to step back, to close the door, to throw the key into the abyss, but her body betrayed her, feet sliding forward over the damp stone as if pulled by a tide, the lantern in her hand flickering lower, struggling against an air that was suddenly heavy, thick, almost drinkable. A cold hand, not entirely solid, closed around her wrist, its grip both gentle and inescapable, and as it drew her closer, she realized the whispers were not random. They were speaking her name, over and over, each time in a tone that matched the voice of someone she had lost, each one promising an end to her hunger, her loneliness, her unanswered questions. The heartbeat that had been behind the wall now thundered in her own chest, its rhythm no longer hers. And when the thing leaned close enough for her to see what lay within those black wells, she understood that she was not staring into eyes but into doors, doors that led only one way, and she had already stepped halfway through. The threshold did not feel like a crossing but like a sinking, as if the air itself had thickened into cold syrup, pulling her inward while her limbs betrayed no resistance, the black water rising to meet her without wetness, swallowing her reflection before she could even see it. The pale shapes beneath the surface stirred, their mouths stretching into wordless invitations, their hands reaching in slow, syrupy arcs that promised both rescue and ruin. And with each inch she sank, the voices in her mind multiplied, layering over one another until they became a single, deafening truth she could no longer deny. She had always been moving toward this place. Every choice, every loss, every unexplainable shadow in her life, a breadcrumb leading her here. The cold hand on her wrist slid higher to her forearm, its touch seeping into her veins until she could feel her pulse sinking with the thing's slow, deliberate rhythm, each beat erasing another thread of memory until the people she once loved became outlines, and even their names bled away. The archway behind her had sealed itself, stone folding in on stone like the mouth of a cave collapsing, and she understood that the world she'd left was not locked out, but dissolved entirely, as though it had never existed. The figure before her grew taller, or perhaps she was shrinking, its face lowering until those endless black doors were all she could see, the depths inside them pulling her forward without a step, without breath, until she was no longer sure which side of them she stood on. And in that moment, just before the last piece of herself was drawn inside, she realized that the pale forms beneath the water were not trying to escape, but to pull her down where they had learned to live, their slow, patient hunger now her own. But there was no awakening, no gasping return to breath, only the awareness that her eyes were open, yet seeing through a liquid haze, the world above the surface a blurred smear of dim light and shifting shadows, her body weightless but no longer hers to command, her limbs moving in unison with the others as though drawn by unseen strings, their pale faces turning toward her in slow, deliberate unison, mouths parting not to speak but to exhale the same stagnant breath she now carried in her own lungs. She could feel it, thick and metallic, swirling through her chest like the memory of blood long stilled, and when she tried to recall her name, it came out in bubbles that dissolved before reaching the surface. Above, the figure loomed on the edge of the black pool, its silhouette flickering between priest, surgeon, and something far older, its head tilting in a motion that felt like recognition, perhaps approval, as if she had passed some unspoken test that countless before her had failed. And then the water around her began to pulse, slow and deep, a heartbeat not her own, yet moving through her bones, aligning her to the rhythm of the chamber, and in that rhythm she understood the truth. This place was not a prison, but a seedbed, the bound souls not captives but roots, feeding something vast and unseen above, their will stripped away so the thing they nourished could grow unchallenged. She felt the tug, gentle yet absolute, at the center of her mind where her choices used to live, pulling her deeper, urging her to let go of the last fragile thread tying her to the world of the living. And in that moment she almost did, almost surrendered entirely to the black pulse, until she saw, through the warped shimmer above, a shape that did not belong, a figure standing at the archway where no doorway should exist, watching her with an intensity that burned even through the water. It was tall, impossibly still, and though its outline was human, there was a fracture in its presence, as if parts of it were made from the wrong kind of time, flickering in and out of the water's reflection, like a memory that didn't belong to her. The moment her gaze locked onto it, The black pulse faltered, a tremor passing through the bound forms around her, their faces twitching as if the figure's appearance had disrupted the rhythm that held them, and in that sudden hesitation she felt her will surge back into her chest like a breath after near drowning, sharp and painful, forcing her to realize that whatever the thing in the archway was, it stood outside the reach of the pool's influence, untouched by the heartbeat of the chamber, a trespasser in a place that allowed no trespass. The robed figure on the edge turned toward the intruder with slow, deliberate precision, and though its face was hidden in the shadow of its hood, the tension in the air deepened until the water seemed to thicken into glass. No one moved, no one breathed, until the intruder raised a single hand, palm open, and the air between them split like a tear in fabric, spilling a thin, cold light that made the chamber flinch, the pulse recoil, the bound souls thrash as if scorched. She didn't understand it, how light could feel so alien, so wrong and right at the same time, but she knew with the certainty of instinct that this was the only moment she would get, the only breach in the endless cycle, and her body strained toward it despite the crushing pull of the water and the cold fingers still wrapped around her mind. The figure in the archway beckoned, a simple motion, yet in it she felt an unspoken promise. Follow, and you will not return. Refuse, and you will never leave. Her muscles screamed against the invisible weight, every step forward feeling like she was wading through a century of wet cement. But the pull toward that thin shard of light was stronger than the current dragging her back, and with each inch she gained, the chamber's architecture seemed to warp, the arches bending like heated iron, the murals on the walls smearing as though the place itself was trying to erase her from its memory. The robed figure extended both arms now, its sleeves empty where hands should have been, and the bound souls began to wail, not in pain, but in a strange, keening protest, as if her leaving would shatter something they needed to remain whole, their cries merging into a vibration that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. The intruder's light rippled across the water, reaching for her, wrapping her in a cold that felt cleaner than anything she'd known here, and for a heartbeat she thought she saw the faces in the water's surface change, no longer strangers, but people she remembered from another life, their mouths forming words she couldn't hear. Her foot broke the water's skin, and the resistance doubled, the black pulse hammering faster, angrier, the robed figure gliding toward her without moving its legs, the space between them collapsing in unnatural silence. The intruder shouted something, a sound like stone grinding under weight, and the tear in the air widened, spilling enough light to make the robed figure hesitate, its hood tilting back just enough for her to see the absence beneath, a hollow that seemed to drink the light and spit it back in jagged shards. She lunged for the archway, every nerve in her body screaming, the cold light wrapping tighter, and for the first time since she'd been pulled into this place, she felt the weight begin to lift, as if the chamber itself was letting her go out of spite rather than mercy. She plunged forward, her body breaking through the trembling veil of light, with the sensation of skin tearing and bone shattering, but when her feet struck the ground beyond, there was no pain, only the deafening quiet of absence, like the world had inhaled and forgotten to breathe her back out. She turned, half expecting to see the robed figure lunging after her, but the arch was already sealing, the liquid darkness folding in on itself until it was nothing but a faint shimmer in the air. And in that fading glint she saw the bound souls sink, their faces slipping beneath the surface without resistance, as if their last act had been to watch her leave. The air here was cold in a way that felt alive, brushing against her skin with deliberate intent, and she realized the space she stood in was not freedom. It was another chamber, older, raw, with walls of living stone that pulsed faintly like the inside of some massive creature. The intruder was there, but no longer just a shadow in the light. It was a man, gaunt, eyes burned into sockets too deep for his thin face, his clothes hanging like they had been stitched from funeral shrouds. And when he spoke her name, it was not with the cadence of someone meeting her, it was the voice of someone remembering her from long before she had been born. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on a floor scattered with brittle fragments that looked like bones but gleamed like glass. And he whispered that she had been pulled into this place because of what she carried, not who she was, and that the robed figure had never been trying to keep her. It had been trying to return her. She felt her pulse stutter, her mind scraping for a shape to fit his words into. But before she could speak, the stone walls rippled, and a sound like distant chains being dragged across hollow ground echoed around them, growing louder until she could taste iron in the air and knew they had not left danger at all. They had merely stepped into its throat. The sound deepened, becoming not just noise but a pressure that pressed into her chest and ribs, as though unseen hands were trying to squeeze the breath from her lungs, and the gaunt man's eyes flicked to the shadows between the pulsing stone walls where shapes began to emerge. Elongated, jointless things that crawled without touching the ground, their limbs bending in wrong directions, their faces smeared with the features of the bound souls she had seen in the arch. They whispered in unison, not words, but the rhythm of chains striking stone, and with each beat the light in the chamber dimmed until it was lit only by the dull glow from the man's eyes. He leaned in so close she could smell the dust in his breath, and told her that if the chains reached her, they would not simply bind her. They would remember every sin her bloodline had ever committed and drag her back through each one, forcing her to live and die in all of them before she could escape. Her mind reeled at the thought of inherited sins becoming shackles, but the floor trembled violently beneath her feet, and a fracture split open, exhaling a cold that had weight, carrying with it whispers of names she did not know yet somehow recognized. The creatures lunged, their limbs snapping forward like whips, and the gaunt man seized her wrist with a strength that belied his thinness, pulling her toward a narrow fissure in the wall, warning her that she could only pass if she did not speak, did not look back, and did not think of the faces behind her, because here thought itself was a beacon. She forced herself into the fissure, the stone squeezing around her like a throat, and the sound of the chains grew muffled, but never stopped, as if following them inside, and in that suffocating darkness, she realized the worst part. The gaunt man was no longer holding her wrist, yet she could still feel fingers wrapped tightly around it. Her breath came shallow in the crushing dark, the unseen fingers on her wrist tightening until the bones ached, guiding her deeper into the narrow passage where the air was stale and heavy, carrying the faint copper tang of old blood, and ahead she could hear something dripping steadily, each drop echoing with a pitch too low to be natural. She tried to match her steps to the rhythm of the drip, thinking it might disguise her presence, but the pressure around her seemed to notice, the stone walls pulsing inward with each beat of her heart, as if the place itself was listening to her body. Then, from somewhere impossibly far, yet right beside her ear, came the whisper of her own name, drawn out, cracked with age, and she froze, because it was spoken not once, but over and over in slightly different voices, each one belonging to a person she had never met, yet somehow remembered losing. The unseen grip on her wrist pulled again, sharper this time, almost frantic, and she stumbled forward until her shoulder struck an opening in the stone, a space wider than the fissure, lit by the faint silver gleam of chains that hung from nothing in the air, each link turning slowly as if moved by invisible currents. Inside each chain's hollow center was an image, not reflected but alive, scenes of people in rooms, streets, and fields, moving without awareness, their eyes glassy, their mouths moving in silent pleas. The fingers on her wrist finally released, but she dared not move, for she saw that one of the scenes was of herself, standing in a dim room she had never seen, staring at a door that rattled from something pounding on the other side. As she leaned closer to understand, the version of herself in the chain turned suddenly, looking directly at her with eyes wide and unblinking, and mouthed something she could not hear, but could feel like cold water in her lungs. She stumbled back, but the chains swayed toward her, stretching as if they meant to wrap around her. And from behind, the whisper came again, closer this time, telling her she had already been here before. She backed away from the swaying chains, her hands scraping the cold wall, but the stone seemed softer now, almost yielding like wet clay, and with every step the texture clung to her skin, as if reluctant to let her go, the faint hum in the air deepening into a vibration that made her teeth ache. Then, in the thick half-light, she saw that the floor beneath her was no longer stone at all, but an unbroken stretch of black water, perfectly still, reflecting not her body, but a shadow that moved before she did, its head turning toward her with a slow, deliberate tilt. She hesitated at the edge, the scent of the water thick with something sour and metallic, and when she glanced back, the passage had sealed, leaving her only with the black expanse ahead, its mirrored surface rippling once, as though something beneath had brushed it from below. She tested it with her foot, expecting to sink, but instead her weight was held as if she were stepping onto glass, and with that first step, the reflection beneath her began to smile, though her own lips did not move. She walked, each footstep sending tremors into the dark below, and the shadow's grin widened until it was split unnaturally high, showing teeth too many and too fine to be human. Then, without warning, the water beneath cracked like ice, a thin fissure racing toward her toes, and from that break spilled a sound, not a splash, but a sharp, keening wail that rose like a scream, forced backward into the throat. She tried to run, but the fissure chased her, the surface breaking away in jagged pieces, and from each opening a hand reached upward, some pale and skeletal, some swollen and slick with black sludge, grasping for her ankles with a desperate strength. As the first cold fingers closed around her leg, she looked down in panic, and the shadow beneath was gone, replaced by her own face submerged, eyes wide open and mouth agape, as if drowning in a place where there was no air to lose. The grip on her leg tightened, and the hands began pulling, the glassy water bending upward like stretched fabric, wrapping around her calves as if determined to pull her under into whatever waited below. She thrashed against the pull, her breaths coming in sharp, shallow bursts. But the more she fought, the more the surface seemed to liquefy, rising around her like a living thing, clinging and dragging with relentless patience, the cold seeping into her bones until her knees buckled. Beneath the transparent skin of the water, she could see shapes moving, bodies pressed against an unseen barrier, their limbs contorted, faces distorted by the refracting blackness, each one mouthing something silently, all in perfect unison. And though she could not hear the words, she felt them vibrate in her chest as if they were spoken inside her. Her hands clawed at the air, searching for something solid, but the horizon had vanished into a gray void, no walls, no ceiling, no escape, only the endless plain of water stretching out in every direction. Then, without warning, the hands below released her, and the sudden absence of force made her stumble forward, the surface hardening beneath her feet again, though her skin still burned from where they had touched her. She thought she was safe, but then she noticed the water wasn't still anymore. Waves began to form in slow, deliberate swells, as if something massive and patient was stirring from the depths. The air grew heavy, the scent of rot thickening until it was almost solid in her throat, and from the far distance a single ripple began to race toward her, cutting through the darkness like a vein of quicksilver. She braced herself, but when it reached her, it didn't break. It passed beneath her feet and through her body like a tremor, and in that moment she saw a vision, not with her eyes, but in her mind. The chains from the chamber above, sinking into this black ocean, attached to something so vast and ancient that its body curved beyond sight, its skin glistening like wet obsidian, its eye opening with a sound like stone grinding again. Stone. The vision ended as quickly as it began, but the effect lingered, her heart hammering, her breath ragged, and the deep, unshakable certainty that whatever waited in the dark below had now noticed her and was slowly, inevitably, rising. She turned to run, but the surface beneath her feet shifted like a breathing lung, forcing her to stagger sideways, every step feeling heavier, as if the black water itself was deciding how far she could go. The distant ripples multiplied, converging into a single rolling swell that moved with the deliberate speed of something that had no reason to rush. And as it came closer, the air seemed to contract, pressing against her skin until her ears rang with a low, grinding hum that vibrated deep in her teeth. She tried not to look down, but her eyes were drawn to the faint outlines moving beneath her, shapes too large to comprehend, their edges blurring into the darkness, the sheer scale making her stomach drop. Then, from the swell, a shadow broke the surface, not violently, but with a slow, calculated emergence, revealing what looked like an enormous curve of bone, slick with some viscous black liquid, carved with lines and symbols that glowed faintly as if lit from within. The sight of it triggered something primal in her, an instinct older than language, telling her she had no business being here, that this was a place where even the dead did not linger. Her pulse pounded so hard it felt like the world itself was keeping time with her heartbeat, and then the glowing lines began to pulse in rhythm, each beat brighter, the hum in her skull growing sharper, clearer, until it wasn't a hum at all but a voice, calm, measured, impossibly deep, whispering her name in a language she should not have been able to understand. She froze, every part of her screaming to move, but her body felt anchored in place, her muscles trembling with useless effort, and she realized the voice wasn't just calling her, it was asking her something, a question that bypassed her ears entirely and burrowed straight into the marrow of her bones. And though she didn't know how, she understood that answering would change her in ways that could never be undone. Her breath came shallow and ragged, each inhale tasting of metal and damp stone, and though every instinct told her to remain silent, the pressure in her skull grew unbearable until the answer, whatever it was, spilled from her lips in a trembling whisper she didn't recognize as her own. The moment the sound left her mouth, the glowing lines along the massive bone flared so bright she had to clamp her eyes shut. Yet the light still seared through her eyelids, branding its shape into her mind. The hum became a roar, not loud, but total, a sound that filled the air, the water, her skin, her blood, her thoughts, until it was impossible to tell where her body ended and the darkness began. Beneath her feet, the lung-like surface shifted again, this time with intent, folding and undulating in slow waves that pushed her forward toward the bone structure, which now rose higher, revealing more of its etched surface, images that seemed to twist and rearrange themselves each time she blinked. She caught glimpses of faces, some human, some impossibly distorted, all locked in expressions that were neither pain nor joy, but something far stranger, like the moment before a scream. The water around her began to ripple outward in concentric circles, each ring sharper than the last, until the reflections fractured into shards, and in those fragments she saw herself. Not as she was now, but older, younger, and something else entirely, forms of her that had never lived and never died, all staring back with the same hollow recognition. The voice spoke again, slower this time, and she realized it wasn't speaking to her alone. It was speaking through her, using her mouth as an instrument, and the words, though incomprehensible, carried weight, as if they were rewriting the air itself. Somewhere far above, or perhaps far below, a dull, resonant thud echoed, followed by another, like a giant heartbeat. And with each pulse the water level began to rise, lapping against her knees, then her waist, pulling her closer to the bone until the etched symbols touched her fingertips, burning cold enough to make her gasp. The moment her fingertips grazed the bone, the cold shot through her arm like liquid mercury, flooding her veins with a numbness so total it felt almost peaceful, until it reached her chest, where it hardened into something sharp, pressing against her heart as though it might split it in two. She wanted to pull away, but the bone's surface seemed to cling to her skin, the carved lines locking into place beneath her fingers, as if recognizing her touch, and the more she struggled, the more it pulled her in, until her palm was flat against it, and her reflection in the rippling water beneath her began to dissolve. Her face melted into something unfamiliar, her eyes black pools reflecting faint pinpricks of light, her mouth moving without her consent, shaping syllables that rose from somewhere far older than language. The water climbed higher, wrapping around her ribs in icy coils, and with each heartbeat, the great thudding sound in the distance grew louder, faster, until it matched her own pulse, synchronizing them into one relentless rhythm. The bone pulsed too, faintly at first, then with a sickening vitality, its ridges flexing beneath her hand, like the breathing of some slumbering thing that had just begun to wake. She felt its awareness turn toward her, not a mind in the human sense, but a vast, crushing intelligence that regarded her as one might regard an insect crawling across a sacred page. A low vibration built inside her skull, not painful but commanding, pushing out every thought that was hers and replacing it with a single, inescapable truth that she could not yet comprehend. Then, without warning, the water surged upward, swallowing her chest, her throat, her mouth, and as it filled her lungs, she realized she was not drowning. She was inhaling it, drinking in the black cold as if it were air, and in that breath she felt the thing in the bone step into her entirely, fitting itself into the shape of her body as though it had always been waiting for her. When her eyes opened, the water was gone, yet everything around her shimmered with a strange clarity, as though the world itself had been scrubbed of lies. The air tasted of iron and smoke, and every surface seemed to hum faintly with the same deep rhythm she had felt in her chest. The pulse of something buried far beneath the earth, older than stone, older than the bone she had touched, older, perhaps, than death itself. Her hands no longer shook, though they did not feel entirely her own, the tendons and joints moving with a precision that was unfamiliar, purposeful, and terrifyingly strong. Her vision pierced the shadows easily, revealing the jagged outlines of shapes she wished she could unsee. Faces pressed into the walls, as if the stone had swallowed them mid-scream, their eyes rolling slowly toward her as if aware of her presence. Somewhere above, the sound of footsteps echoed, too slow and deliberate to belong to anyone human, and yet she knew instinctively that they were coming for her, not to kill her, but to bring her where the rest of the bone waited. In the silence between each step, she heard whispers, not in her ears, but in her blood, urging her to leave the chamber and ascend, to see the truth that had been hidden in plain sight for centuries. The air grew warmer as she walked, each breath heavier, carrying with it the scent of burned offerings and something sweet, rotting. The walls narrowed until she was pressed on both sides, her skin brushing against the damp rock, and then they opened abruptly into a vast chamber lit by no visible flame, yet glowing with a steady, unnatural light. At its center stood a structure of bones arranged in a perfect spiral, each one engraved with markings that matched the ones she had felt under her fingertips. And as she stepped closer, the whispers in her blood rose to a deafening roar, until she realized they were not Kay calling her forward but bowing to her. In that moment she understood. She had not found the relic had found her, and whatever had slept in the dark was now awake, wearing her face, speaking through her voice, and ready to finish what it had begun long before she was born.